Rain pattered against the windshield as Officer James Bradley watched droplets merge and split his cold coffee growing colder by the minute, while his mind wandered to the three complaints that had mysteriously vanished from his record last month. His fingers caressed the department-issued firearm, a habit that had grown stronger with each passing year on the force. As he watched expensive cars roll by in this affluent neighborhood, his eyes narrowing at any driver who didn't fit his idea of belonging. The radio crackled with routine updates, but Bradley barely registered the voices anymore, his mind drifting to the argument he'd had with Internal Affairs last week about his increasing number of excessive force complaints. Captain Richards had pulled him aside, speaking in that soft, disappointing tone that Bradley had grown to despise, telling him to tone down his approach. But Bradley knew better. He believed he was the only one who truly understood how to maintain order in these streets. Checking his watch, Bradley noticed his shift had another 4 hours to go, the evening sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Heights, a neighborhood he had patrolled for over a decade. The residents here trusted him, or at least that's what he told himself, ignoring the whispers and sideways glances from the younger officers who questioned his methods behind his back. His dashboard computer displayed the latest crime statistics for the area, showing another decrease in reported incidents. Bradley took personal credit for those numbers, even though deep down he knew his aggressive tactics had simply scared people into avoiding this route altogether, especially after sunset. The thought brought a grim smile to his weathered face as he remembered how his father, another cop from a different era, had taught him that fear was the most effective tool in law enforcement. A message flashed across his computer screen, another complaint filed against him from last week's traffic stop involving a Hispanic teenager. Bradley scoffed, deleting the notification without reading it. Just like the others that had come before, the brass would handle it. They always did. His connection with the police union and certain influential community members had kept him safely employed despite the growing stack of grievances against him. Reaching for his now empty coffee cup, Bradley noticed his hand trembling slightly, a new development that had started after his wife left him 6 months ago, taking their daughter and leaving nothing but divorce papers and silence in their wake. She had called his behavior increasingly erratic, but Bradley saw it differently. The world was changing, becoming softer, weaker, and someone had to maintain the old standards. The dashboard camera blinked its steady red light, reminding Bradley of its constant surveillance. He had learned long ago which angles to use, which words to say, and which reports to file to keep his record clean. Despite the growing darkness inside him, the same darkness that had driven away everyone who had ever tried to get close, the same shadow that now colored every traffic stop, every interaction, every moment of his patrol. Another car rolled past, this one a pristine luxury sedan. Bradley checked the plates automatically, his jaw tightening when he saw they were from out of state. His instincts, honed by years of profiling, told him something was off about the driver, but even he had to admit it was nothing more than the color of the man's skin. The thought should have bothered him, should have triggered some sort of moral warning, but those alerts had been silenced long ago, replaced by a cold certainty that he alone could see the truth. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of his patrol car, creating a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Bradley adjusted his mirror, catching sight of his own reflection, the lines around his eyes deeper than he remembered, the gray at his temples more pronounced than ever. Yet it was the hardness in his gaze that gave him pause, a look he had seen before in officers who had eventually crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. Marcus Thompson adjusted his pressed suit in the rearview mirror, the memory of his commanding officer pinning the silver star to his chest still fresh. Even after 3 years, his civilian life had settled into a comfortable routine. As a high school guidance counselor, the flash of military medals hanging from his mirror reminded him daily of the brotherhood he had found in service, where bullets and bombs cared nothing about skin color. The thought brought a sad smile as he drove home from a successful college preparation seminar. The afternoon sun caught the edge of his silver star, making it gleam against the backdrop of his other decorations, each medal telling a story of sacrifice and brotherhood like the Bronze Star awarded after he carried 300 soldiers to safety under heavy fire in Kandahar, or the Purple Heart from the IED that nearly took his left leg, the scars still visible beneath his perfectly pressed slacks, a daily reminder of both the cost and value of service. Checking his watch, Marcus realized he still had time to prepare for tomorrow's Veterans Support Group meeting, where he helped former soldiers transition to civilian life. His own journey hadn't been easy. The nightmares still came, sometimes bringing him back to dusty streets and exploding buildings, but he had found purpose in guiding others through their struggles, especially the young veterans who reminded him of his fallen brothers. His phone buzzed quietly in its holder, another message from the school principal, praising his work with troubled students. Marcus had a gift for connecting with kids others had written off. He saw beneath their tough exteriors to the fear and uncertainty that lay beneath, just as his own mentor, Sergeant Rodriguez, had seen past his angry teenage figure 20 years ago, guiding him toward military service instead of the street life that had claimed so many of his childhood friends. The school's parking lot had been full of promise today. As he watched seniors clutching college acceptance letters, their eyes bright with possibilities he had helped create, Marcus remembered his own graduation, how different it had felt knowing he was headed to basic training while his classmates went to universities. But that path had shaped him, forged him into someone who could now bridge worlds between military and civilian life, between struggling students and their brighter futures. Music played softly from his car's speakers, classical pieces he had discovered during long nights in Afghanistan, where Mozart and Bach had drowned out the sound of distant firefights. These days, the same melodies helped calm his hypervigilance, a constant companion since his return home, though he had learned to channel that awareness into protecting his students, teaching them to navigate life's dangers while maintaining their dignity. His briefcase in the passenger seat held 15 college recommendation letters he had stayed late to complete, each one carefully crafted to highlight the unique strengths of his students, especially those who reminded him of himself at their age, young people facing systemic barriers but refusing to let circumstances define their futures, just as he had refused to let others' expectations limit his own path. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, reminding Marcus of his last sunset in Kabul. Before boarding the transport home, he had promised himself then that he would find a way to continue serving others, even without a uniform. That oath had led him to counseling, first helping fellow veterans, then expanding to guide young people toward their dreams, using his own story as proof that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Tomorrow he would meet with the school board to propose a new mentorship program pairing veterans with at-risk youth, an initiative born from his observation that many troubled students responded well to the structure and purpose he had found in military service. The proposal was typed and ready in his briefcase, next to those recommendation letters, representing his continued mission to build bridges between communities. Marcus adjusted his tie one final time, a habit learned in basic training that had never left him. His reflection showed a man who had found his place in the world, despite or perhaps because of the challenges he had faced. The medals, swaying gently from his mirror, caught the last rays of sunlight, their gleam a reminder that valor and service came in many forms, some on battlefields, others in quiet moments of guidance and understanding. The red and blue lights exploded in Marcus' mirror like angry fireworks, his heart rate quickening not from fear but from the familiar tension that came with these moments, his dashcam capturing the perfect 3-second signal he had used, his military training kicking in as he pulled into the well-lit parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store, positioning his car where security cameras could capture everything, just as he had taught countless young people in his community workshops. Years of experience, both in combat zones and civilian streets, had taught Marcus the importance of controlling variables in dangerous situations. He deliberately chose the spot beneath the brightest parking lot light, ensuring that the store's security cameras had clear sightlines from multiple angles, while his own dashcam recorded with perfect clarity the fact that he had followed every traffic law to the letter, performing a textbook stop that gave no legitimate cause for concern. Marcus could see the patrol car in his mirrors, its headlights burning bright enough to create a wall of light that reminded him of nighttime operations in Afghanistan. His hands moved with practiced precision to the top of the steering wheel, positioned exactly at 10, and to his military ID already placed beside his civilian license. On the dashboard, where they would be clearly visible through the window, his movements slow, deliberate, and carefully choreographed to avoid any possibility of misinterpretation. The evening shoppers passing by began to slow their pace, some pulling out phones, others stopping entirely to watch the scene unfold. Marcus recognized their behavior from his combat training. Civilians, sensing impending conflict, their instincts telling them to document what was about to happen. He caught glimpses of their faces in his mirrors, concern, curiosity, and something darker, a recognition that they were about to witness another moment in an ongoing American tragedy. His phone sat in its holder, still recording the navigation directions he had been following to a veterans meeting. The screen, now capturing audio of the approaching footsteps. Marcus could tell from the sound that the officer was moving with aggressive intent, the irregular pace and heavy falls indicating someone operating on emotion rather than procedure. It was the kind of walk he had learned to recognize in hostile territories when someone was looking for a fight rather than following protocol. The store's automatic doors kept opening and closing as more people gathered, their presence oddly comforting to Marcus, who had learned in Afghanistan that witnesses could mean the difference between life and death. He noted the growing crowd in his side mirrors while keeping his eyes forward, maintaining the perfect balance of compliance and dignity that he had practiced countless times and taught to others in his community outreach programs. Through his rearview mirror, Marcus caught sight of his military medals, swaying slightly from the mirror, their movement caused by the vibration of his idling engine. The silver star caught the fluorescent light of the parking lot, creating a brief flash that drew his eyes upward to the security camera mounted on the nearby lamppost, its red recording light, steady and reassuring like the distant flare of a friendly position during a night patrol. The sound of a radio crackled through the evening air, carrying fragments of dispatcher codes that Marcus recognized from his security consulting work with local law enforcement, the codes indicating a routine traffic stop. But the officer's approach suggested something else entirely. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, his combat training, automatically engaging, measuring distances, calculating angles, noting potential cover positions, even as he remained perfectly still in his seat. Time seemed to stretch in that peculiar way it had during 5 fights, each second expanding to contain volumes of observation and analysis. Marcus noted every detail, the gathering crowd, the steady hum of his engine, the slight tremor in the officer's walk, the way the security cameras turned to track the movement below, all of it filtering through his experienced mind, building a complete tactical picture of a situation that was rapidly moving beyond standard procedure. Sweat beaded on Bradley's forehead, despite the cool evening air, his body camera recording his ragged breathing as he approached the sedan with his weapon already drawn, the sight of the military medals triggering something dark inside him, memories of his own rejected military application bubbling to the surface like toxic waste, his voice cracking with barely contained rage as he barked contradictory commands at the calm figure whose steady gaze in the mirror only fueled his anger. The parking lot lights cast harsh shadows across Bradley's face, highlighting the twitch in his left eye, a nervous tic that had developed over years of increasing paranoia and bitterness. His rejection from the military academy 15 years ago played through his mind like a broken record, the words medically unfit for service and psychological concerns blurring together with every step he took toward the sedan, his grip tightening on his weapon until his knuckles turned white beneath the fluorescent glare. Each medal hanging from Marcus' rearview mirror seemed to mock Bradley, reminding him of his own failures, the silver star catching light and reflecting it back like an accusation. His body camera continued its relentless recording, capturing every tremor in his voice, every unauthorized step in his approach, the sound of his boots on the asphalt echoing with an irregular rhythm that spoke of barely contained violence. Bradley could feel the eyes of the gathering crowd, their phones raised like silent judges, documenting his descent into darkness. but he was too far gone to care. Years of unchecked bias and growing instability crystallizing into this moment, his training and procedures abandoned in favor of raw emotion. The sight of a successful black veteran sitting calmly in an expensive car in his neighborhood proved too much for his fragile grip on reality. The words tumbled from his mouth, a toxic stream of contradictions, first demanding Marcus' hands up, then screaming at him not to move, ordering him to show his ID, while commanding him to keep his hands visible, his bodycam recording every impossible demand, the tremor in his voice growing more pronounced with each passing second as he circled the vehicle like a predator searching for justification. Memories of his own father, a decorated officer from another era, flooded Bradley's mind, mixing with the shame of his rejected military application and the growing pressure of internal affairs investigations, his recent divorce, the whispers of other officers, all of it swirling together into a storm of resentment that found its target in the composed veteran whose very presence seemed to represent everything Bradley had failed to achieve. The security cameras continued their silent witness as Bradley moved closer to the driver's window, his weapon now mere inches from Marcus' temple, sweat dripping from his chin onto his uniform, the evening air thick with tension as shoppers stopped in their tracks, some fumbling with phones, others frozen in horror at the scene unfolding before them like a slow-motion car crash that no one could prevent. Bradley could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, drowning out the distant sound of sirens, his body camera capturing the wild look in his eyes, reflected in the car's window, the same look that had caused the military psychiatric evaluator to stamp rejected on his application all those years ago, the same expression that had made his wife pack her bags and leave in the middle of the night, taking their daughter and her dreams of a normal life. The medals swayed gently in the evening breeze, their movement catching Bradley's attention. Again, each decoration a reminder of the respect and honor he had desperately sought but never earned, his finger tightening on his weapon's trigger as years of repressed rage and failure threatened to explode in one catastrophic moment, the cameras recording every second as he stood on the edge of an abyss he had been approaching for years, each complaint, each investigation, each whispered doubt pushing him closer to this breaking point. Time seemed to slow as Bradley caught sight of Marcus' combat veteran hat, the officer's face contorting with an ugly sneer as he spat out words that would later make headlines across the nation, his bodycam picking up every syllable, every racist slur, while Marcus remained stone still, his military training, the only thing keeping him centered as the barrel of Bradley's gun trembled inches from his temple. Security cameras capturing the growing crowd of horrified onlookers, their phones raised like silent witnesses. The evening air grew thick with tension as Bradley unleashed a torrent of hatred, each word captured in crystal clear audio by multiple devices, his bodycam recording the twisted expression on his face as he fixated on the combat veteran hat that Marcus wore with quiet dignity, the cap bearing the insignia of his infantry division, the same unit that Bradley's father had failed to qualify for decades ago, adding another layer of bitter resentment to his rapidly deteriorating mental state. Marcus remained perfectly still, his breathing measured and controlled, just as he had done when facing down insurgents in narrow alleyways, his mind calculating angles and distances, noting the positions of witnesses, mapping potential escape routes, while maintaining an outward appearance of complete calm, his years of combat experience telling him that any sudden movement could trigger the increasingly unstable officer whose finger now rested too heavily on the trigger. The crowd had grown larger, their collective gasp audible as Bradley pressed the barrel harder against Marcus' temple, his racist tirade becoming more incoherent with each passing second. Store employees emerged to witness the scene, their faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking lot as they added their phone cameras to the gallery of digital witnesses, some already live streaming the encounter to social media platforms where viewer counts climbed rapidly. Through his peripheral vision, Marcus could see mothers pulling children behind cars, elderly shoppers shakily dialing 911, and young people spreading out to capture the incident from multiple angles, their instincts honed by years of similar videos, their faces showing a mixture of outrage and resigned recognition of an all too familiar scene playing out in their community, while Bradley seemed oblivious to everything except his own spiraling hatred. Bradley circled the car like a wounded animal, his boots scraping against the asphalt in an irregular rhythm that spoke of mounting instability, his free hand gesturing wildly as he continued his verbal assault, the medals in the mirror catching the light and reflecting it back into his eyes, seeming to trigger new waves of incoherent rage, each decoration representing another reminder of his own failures and rejections, his bodycam capturing every moment of his psychological unraveling. The tension reached a fever pitch as Bradley noticed the silver star among Marcus' medals, his voice cracking as he demanded to know how someone like Marcus could have earned such an honor, his words dripping with prejudice and bitter envy, while his weapon hand trembled more violently. Marcus remained absolutely still, his military training screaming at him to act, while his wisdom gained from years of navigating racial prejudice taught him to wait, drawing upon reserves of patience and discipline that had served him well in both war zones and civilian life. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail their sound, barely registering through the fog of Bradley's hatred as he pressed his weapon harder against Marcus' temple, screaming about stolen valor and affirmative action, his words becoming a jumbled mess of conspiracy theories and personal grievances, each syllable carefully recorded by the multiple devices capturing this moment of crisis, the security cameras continuing their steady electronic vigil. As the situation teetered on the edge of tragedy, Officer Sarah Chen had taken the long road on her patrol that night, a decision that would later be called divine intervention, her years of de-escalation training kicking in as she rolled up to the scene, her blood running cold at the sight of her fellow officer pressing a gun against a black man's head, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife as she drew her own weapon, not knowing which of her fellow officers she could trust in this moment. The parking lot lights cast stark shadows across the scene as Chen quickly assessed the situation, her mind racing through her crisis intervention protocols. While her dashcam recorded her approach, she noted the growing crowd of witnesses, the steady red lights of dozens of recording phones, the military medals hanging from the mirror, and most crucially the wild look in her fellow officers' eyes, a look she had seen before in officers who had finally broken under the weight of their own prejudices. Chen had spent years building bridges between the department and the community. She served her own experience as a second-generation Chinese American officer, giving her unique insight into the complexities of law enforcement in a diverse society. Now all of that experience crystallized into this moment as she positioned her patrol car at an angle that would give her tactical advantage while blocking any potential line of fire toward the gathered civilians. Her voice remained steady as she announced her presence, using the calm but authoritative tone that had diffused countless situations. Before identifying herself clearly for the benefit of both her bodycam and the civilian recordings, she could see Bradley flinch at the sound of her voice, his weapon hand trembling more violently as he turned his head slightly toward her, his eyes showing no recognition, only a desperate cornered rage that made him more dangerous. Marcus remained perfectly still in his vehicle, his military training evident in his controlled breathing and steady hands. Chen recognized the combat veteran hat and immediately understood she was dealing with someone who had extensive crisis training himself. Their eyes met briefly in the rearview mirror, a silent communication passing between them as Chen took another careful step forward, her own weapon held at the ready, while she continued attempting to reach through Bradley's haze of hatred. The crowd had grown eerily quiet, their phones still recording as Chen began to speak again, using Bradley's first name, reminding him of their shared training, their duty to protect and serve the community, her words chosen carefully to penetrate the fog of his psychological break. While she maintained her tactical position, her free hand had already activated her radio, calling for additional units and specifically requesting the crisis intervention team. Time seemed to stretch as Chen took another measured step forward. She could see sweat dripping from Bradley's chin onto his uniform, his fingers still too tight on the trigger, while his tirade of racial slurs and confused accusations continued. But with less intensity, her presence had introduced a new variable into his broken narrative, forcing his mind to deal with the contradiction of a fellow officer opposing his actions. Chen could hear the approaching sirens in the distance, but knew this situation would end one way or another before they arrived. She kept her voice steady as she continued to speak to Bradley, reminding him of specific moments they had shared as colleagues, bringing up details that would ground him in reality, while subtly shifting her position to get a clearer angle. Her years of training and experience focused entirely on these crucial seconds. The security cameras continued their silent witness as Chen managed another step forward, close enough now to see the name tag on Bradley's chest gleaming under the fluorescent lights, close enough to smell the stale coffee on his breath, close enough to see the exact moment when something in his eyes began to change, the first glimmer of recognition breaking through his hatred like a ray of sunlight, piercing storm clouds. The police chief's face grew ashen as he watched the footage in his office the next morning, his hands trembling as he signed the immediate termination papers, while outside his window protesters began to gather their signs demanding justice. Catching the morning light, internal affairs investigators worked through the night, uncovering a pattern so clear and devastating it would shake the department to its core. Video footage from multiple angles flooded social media channels, each new perspective revealing something more damning than the last. Officer Chen's bodycam footage, showing her textbook de-escalation approach, contrasting sharply with Bradley's unhinged behavior. The security cameras providing crystal clear overhead views that left no room for misinterpretation, while civilian recordings captured the raw emotional impact of the confrontation from every possible angle. Inside the Internal Affairs Office, Lieutenant Maria Ramirez led a team working frantically through 15 years of traffic stop data, their computers processing thousands of incidents, revealing a pattern of racial profiling so blatant it seemed impossible that it had gone unchecked for so long. Leaked emails and text messages between Bradley and certain superior officers suggested a deliberate effort to bury previous complaints, creating a paper trail of institutional complicity. The chief's secretary worked steadily through a growing stack of media requests as news vans began filling the parking lot, their satellite dishes rising like metal flowers in the morning sun. National networks had already picked up the story, running the footage on continuous loops, while political commentators and civil rights leaders booked flights to the city, preparing statements and organizing rallies that would continue for weeks to come. Lieutenant Ramirez discovered a hidden folder in the department's digital archives containing dozens of civilian complaints against Bradley dating back to his first year on the force, each one showing a similar pattern of aggressive behavior and racial bias. The complaints had been systematically buried through a complex web of departmental procedures and unofficial arrangements that would ultimately lead to the resignation of 3 senior officers and 2 city council members. The morning sun climbed higher as the chief prepared for a press conference, his practiced words feeling hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence of institutional failure. Outside his window, the crowd of protesters had grown larger, their chants echoing through the building, while inside investigators continued uncovering years of mishandled complaints, false reports, and covered-up incidents, each new revelation adding another crack to the department's foundation. Officer Chen sat in a separate office, providing a detailed statement, her clear account of the previous night's events and her history of reporting concerning behavior from fellow officers, painting a picture of someone who had tried to change the system from within. Her personnel file revealed multiple attempts to flag Bradley's escalating behavior, warnings that had been repeatedly ignored by supervisors more concerned with protecting their own than serving their community. In the evidence room, technicians carefully catalogued every piece of digital footage, creating a timeline that showed the incident from every angle, while computer forensics experts dug deeper into departmental records, revealing a pattern of deleted emails, altered reports, and suspicious transfers that suggested a coordinated effort to protect problem officers from accountability. Their findings would eventually lead to a federal investigation of the entire department. The chief's phone rang continuously as city officials scrambled to respond to the crisis. Media outlets competed for exclusive interviews, and civil rights attorneys prepared lawsuits that would eventually cost the city millions in settlements. Outside, the protests grew larger, more organized, as community leaders arrived to address the crowds, their speeches carrying through the building, while inside, investigators continued to uncover evidence of systemic failures that had enabled Bradley to remain on the force despite years of documented misconduct. The courthouse hummed with tension as Marcus took the stand, his testimony delivered with such dignity and power that several jurors openly wept. Bradley sat slouched at the defense table, his former arrogance replaced by a hollow stare as witness after witness described similar encounters, their stories weaving together into an undeniable tapestry of abuse and prejudice. The prosecution presenting 15 years of traffic stop data that painted a damning statistical picture of targeted harassment. Sunlight filtered through the high courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the gallery, where community members, journalists, and fellow officers sat in rapt attention as Marcus recounted that night, his military training evident in his precise descriptions and measured tone. The combat veteran describing the incident with the same tactical clarity he had once used to brief commanding officers in war zones, his words carrying the weight of both personal experience and professional assessment. Officer Chen testified next. Her account of the incident, professionally delivered but emotionally devastating, as she described the look in Bradley's eyes that night, the prosecution playing her bodycam footage in slow motion, highlighting every crucial decision she made, every attempt to de-escalate the situation. Legal experts in the gallery nodded in approval as she explained her crisis intervention training, demonstrating the stark contrast between proper procedure and Bradley's actions. The defense attorney appeared increasingly desperate as expert witnesses dismantled each of his arguments. Statistical analysts presented heat maps showing the racial disparity in Bradley's traffic stops. Psychiatrists discussed the warning signs that had been ignored for years. Police training experts detailed the numerous violations of department policy by civil rights attorneys, outlined the pattern of institutional failure that had enabled his behavior to escalate unchecked. Bradley seemed to shrink further into himself with each new testimony, his eyes darting between the exits as former colleagues took the stand, describing his increasingly erratic behavior in the years leading up to the incident. Internal affairs investigators presented their findings, revealing the complex web of cover-ups and ignored complaints that had allowed him to remain on the force, despite numerous red flags, their evidence suggesting a deeper rot within the department itself. The prosecution methodically built their case, introducing body camera footage from dozens of previous incidents, each showing the same pattern of aggressive behavior and racial bias. Computer forensics experts testified about deleted emails and altered reports, while department whistleblowers described the unofficial policy of protecting problem officers, the evidence mounting like an avalanche that threatened to bury not just Bradley but the entire system that had enabled him. In the courthouse hallways, activists held impromptu press conferences while city officials huddled with their lawyers discussing settlement amounts and policy changes. Local community leaders organized peaceful demonstrations on the courthouse steps, their signs visible through the windows as a constant reminder of the broader implications of this case for police reform and racial justice across the nation. Marcus' family sat in the front row throughout the trial, their quiet dignity a powerful presence in the courtroom, his teenage daughters watching their father testify with proud tears in their eyes, while his fellow veterans filled several rows behind them, their combat decorations gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a silent testament to the service and sacrifice that Bradley had attempted to diminish and disrespect. Police reform advocates took detailed notes as evidence of departmental failures was presented, building a case for systematic changes that would eventually be implemented in departments across the country, while legal scholars began preparing articles about the precedent-setting nature of the prosecution. Civil rights attorneys gathered evidence for a series of class action lawsuits that would force departments nationwide to confront their own systemic issues. The jury listened intently, their faces reflecting the emotional weight of the testimony, some taking careful notes, others sitting in stunned silence As the full scope of Bradley's actions and the department's complicity became clear, the evidence presenting not just a case against one officer, but an indictment of a system that had failed its most basic duty to protect and serve all members of the community equally and fairly. The judge, citing the egregious abuse of power pattern of behavior and the grace shown by Marcus throughout the ordeal, sentenced Bradley to life in prison, marking a historic moment in police accountability. Marcus went on to become an advocate for police reforms, speaking at conferences nationwide, while Officer Chen was promoted to lead a new department focused on community relations and eliminating bias in policing. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Judge Maria Santos delivered her precedent-setting sentence, her words echoing through a courtroom so silent observers could hear the scratch of reporters' pens on paper. She spoke of the sacred trust between law enforcement and community, the weight of the badge and the devastating consequences when that trust is betrayed, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the bench as she outlined the systematic failures that had enabled Bradley's behavior. Marcus stood tall as the sentence was read, his military bearing evident in his straight spine and steady gaze, while Bradley seemed to collapse into himself, the former officer looking small and defeated in his prison jumpsuit, as the judge detailed how his actions had not only traumatized countless individuals but had damaged the very foundation of community trust in law enforcement. The gallery's quiet tension broken only by muffled sobs and the constant click of camera shutters. Outside, the courthouse crowds erupted in celebration as the verdict was announced. Civil rights leaders gathered on the steps to declare this a turning point in the fight for police accountability, while policy experts began discussing the nationwide implications of the case. Officer Chen, standing among her fellow officers, represented a new generation of law enforcement leadership committed to reform and rebuilding community trust through transparency and accountability. In the months that followed, Marcus established the Thompson Initiative for Police Reform, his organization working directly with law enforcement agencies to implement new training protocols focused on de-escalation, implicit bias awareness, and community engagement. His military experience and personal story proving powerful tools in bridging gaps between police departments and the communities they served, particularly in areas with historically strained relationships. Officer Chen, now Captain Chen, led the department's newly established Office of Community Accountability and Reform, her promotion marking a significant shift in departmental culture. Under her leadership, the department became a national model for progressive policing practices, implementing strict oversight measures, enhanced training requirements, and innovative community engagement programs that would later be adopted by cities across the country. The case sparked a nationwide movement for police reform, with departments facing increasing pressure to address systemic bias and implement meaningful accountability measures. Legal scholars cited the verdict in numerous cases, leading to similar convictions and departmental overhauls, while police unions were forced to reckon with their role in protecting officers who betrayed their oath to serve and protect. Marcus continued his work as a high school guidance counselor, his story becoming a powerful teaching tool as he helped young people understand both their rights and responsibilities in interactions with law enforcement. His military medals, still hanging from his rearview mirror, now served as a reminder not just of his service overseas, but of his ongoing mission to create positive change at home. Bradley began serving his sentence at a maximum security facility, his case becoming required reading in police academies across the nation as an example of how unchecked bias and systemic failures could corrupt the sacred trust between law enforcement and community. The detailed evidence of his gradual descent serving as a warning sign for departments to recognize and address similar behavior patterns before they escalated to the point of tragedy. 5 years after the sentence, Judge Santos attended the opening of the new Community Police Training Center, where both Marcus and Captain Chen served as lead instructors. Their collaborative approach to reform drawing praise from civil rights activists and law enforcement officials, alike, the center becoming a symbol of how tragedy could be transformed into positive change through dedication, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to justice.